Live everywhere.
Daily Kos Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Waldman. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning. How you doing, everybody? It is Wednesday, May 29th, 2019. Time for another show. It's Wednesday already. I know it seems like we've skipped ahead, but that's because we did skip ahead for one day. The holiday weekend eliminated a Monday on us and got us one step closer to the increasingly non-existent weekend. That is the days at the end of the week where we're supposed to have a respite from the craziness of the president. But certainly it seems these days like, well, you know, he takes things into the weekend and doesn't seem to acknowledge the work week the way the rest of us do. Time now for another show, and Bill reminds us all the way from Portland, Maine, Daily Kos Radio is live now. Today, the world briefly stops what it's doing as Kagro X, me, David Waldman, holds a Viking funeral for the Biden rule. It left us too early, darn it. True. Everyone talking about Mitch McConnell's admission, should we call it, yesterday? Let's see. Let me grab the story here. Everybody's tweeting it around. I don't know who reported it first, but I saw maybe the first basic rundown of it on CNN. Sigh. This is just one of those things why we can't have nice things, I guess. In a reversal from 2016, McConnell says he would fill a potential Supreme Court vacancy in 2020. You all know what that means, of course. He was asked by, where was he? What is this thing? Let's see. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said Tuesday, that was yesterday, if a Supreme Court vacancy occurs during the next year's presidential election, he would work to confirm a nominee appointed by President Donald Trump. No surprise there, except for, I don't know, idiots and people who think that he was ever going to be consistent in any way. It says that is a move that is in sharp contrast, it's an interesting way of putting it, to his decision to block President Barack Obama's nominee to the High Court following the death of Justice Antonin Scalia in February of 2016. At the time, he cited the right of the voters in the presidential election to decide whether a Democrat or a Republican would fill that opening, a move that infuriated Democrats. Speaking at a Paducah Chamber of Commerce luncheon, okay, that's the answer, in Kentucky, McConnell was asked by an attendee, should a Supreme Court justice die next year? And I said, sure, why not? But I think it has to do with which one. No, but should a Supreme Court justice die next year, what will your position be on filling that spot? The leader, what a leader he is, the institutionalist, took a long sip of what appeared to be iced tea. Long Island iced tea. He's a drunkard. I don't know. Anyway, so I don't know why they put that in there. But he took a long sip of what appeared to be iced tea before announcing with a smile, such as he has the ability to display, oh, we'd fill it, triggering loud laughter from the audience. Ha, ha, ha. Hypocrisy is hilarious. And, you know, go ahead, call him a hypocrite, do whatever you want. He doesn't care. That was always the answer. I mean, the rest of the article and the rest of all the writing is attempts to make some sort of sense of it. I saw, was it Joe Sonka saying this morning, yeah, you know, there are actually people who write for a living about politics who are out here saying what a surprising development, what a surprising announcement, a surprising reversal. There's nothing surprising about it. It was gimmitarian from the beginning, and so all I can say is big LOL, as though it didn't matter to the rest of us. Big LOL to all the political writers who wrote it down every time he said that it was a Biden rule, whatever that was supposed to mean, and he was enforcing a long-standing tradition, et cetera, and they just wrote it down because journalism's a guy said it, and I have to report it. You know, I don't know. I don't know who to blame it on, because, of course, most of the reporters who wrote it down also did eventually, and maybe that's the problem. Follow up with, no, there really isn't any such thing. And even references to Joe Biden are pretty tenuous as it is. But no, there's no rule, formal, informal, or otherwise, that says that you don't confirm a Supreme Court nominee in an election year. And everybody proved that by, looking at history and doing a little bit of Googling and saying, look, they approved this guy in an election year. They approved this guy in an election year. It's just raw power politics. And I guess what's surprising to some people is that, no, Mitch McConnell will just turn right around and tell you, oh, no, I do what I want to do. Whatever's politically advantageous for me and my friends is what my principle is. But please keep writing more articles about he's an institutionalist. So, all right. I guess that gets us to the point where it's now time to get excited for Pat Leahy's unsolicited announcement that he will revive the Biden rule should he come into the chairmanship of the Judiciary Committee following the next elections. So, you can always count on him to do something brilliant like that. I don't know why the blue slip fight didn't make it obvious. I don't know why any of the fights haven't made it obvious, but I don't know. I mean, it's another symptom of the same thing. Why won't we say Trump's a liar? I don't know. It seems uncomfortable. Why won't we say that more than that McConnell's a hypocrite, but that he's just playing pure, simple, raw power politics? It was last time. It will be next time. I don't know. Instead, it's a surprising reversal from 2016. Everything's a surprising reversal if everything is situational, but yeah, whatever. Okay, I don't know. People might not even have turned their attention to this. They're still arguing over whether or not Maggie Haberman did a terrible job on discussing whether or not answering a subpoena is an existential question. Rest of the journalistic community coming to her defense, and then of course trotting. I guess for old time's sake, they trotted out the old, well, if everybody's mad at her, she must be doing something right, which is, of course, just all that much more infuriating. When our complaint about you is that you're both siders, and then as proof that you're right, both sides, then nothing could be more infuriating. But maybe they're just trying to troll us. Anyway, it's been a long time since we heard from Greg Dworkin. Greg, you must have plenty to catch us up on since last week. Good morning. How are you?
Good morning. Well, stuff happened.
Yeah, that's good. All right. Well, that sums it up. Good. Now you're free to
now I can go.
Freelance on this thing or just freestyle it however you want now.
Or just, make it up on the fly.
Yeah, sure. Why not? What a surprising thing. In a surprise move, Greg Dworkin made up all the news on Wednesday. And, I'm just so surprised.
So
but
let's
both
talk
sides.
Elections and re-electile dysfunction.
Okay. Sure.
Trump is up for election.
We're familiar with it.
He's got issues.
Yes.
And it's so interesting. One of the pure looks at how generic Republican would do is fitting the current president into economic models that people have put together to try to predict who winds up winning the election. Steve Ratner summarized a lot of these incorrectly, I think, because it lacks context. But he has an article called Trump's Formidable 2020 Tailwind. It really should be headwind, and I'll explain.
Okay.
The economy and incumbency drive presidential election outcomes. Now, this hasn't been true for some years, but it's one of those things that people who don't look at this very deeply will say, oh, it's the economy, stupid. The economy is just roaring and doing really, really well. Therefore, Trump's going to be elected and reelected.
That's
elected for the rest of his life.
Okay.
And that's not how it works at all.
Can't believe it.
And it hasn't worked that way for a while. G. Elliott Morris has put together some really lovely charts pointing out that people's opinion of the economy hasn't matched their vote for the president in the last several elections, including the midterms. But let's go back to the original classic models. Trump's Formidable 2020 Tailwind is based on the fact that the economy ranks among the top issues in the minds of voters. And Ray Fair, a professor at Yale, has put together a model and finds that the growth rates of gross domestic product and inflation have been the two most important economic predictors, and incumbency is also important. So he puts these models in, they fail, and then he gets credit for having such a terrific model.
That is great.
Right? In 2008, it predicted that Barack Obama would receive 53.1% of the popular vote. His share actually totaled 53.7 in 2012. Its final estimate was a vote of 51.8 and very close, 0.2% away from where it is. When the 2016 election rolled around, a surprising result emerged. According to the model, and this is what happens when you have n equals 2. When the 2016 election rolled out, according to the model, Donald Trump should have received 54.1% of the vote. In actuality, he received 48.8%. In other words, it was wrong. He, in fact, lost the popular vote.
Yeah.
But put that aside, because we can hand wave that away and say, oh, these models are great. For example, Ratner says, I'm quite confident that the gap was a function of the generally unfavorable rankings on Mr. Trump's personal qualities. In other words, a more normal Republican would likely have won the popular vote by a substantial margin, instead of losing it by 3 million votes. Therefore, trust the model because Trump is the actual person.
Okay.
Right? And you go, okay. Actually, and he points out Mark Zandi, who's the chief economist at Moody's Analytics, has looked at 12 models and Mr. Trump wins in all of them. Ratner says, okay, well, that means that, he's got a great chance for re-election. I look at this, normal people look at this and say, actually, what this is telling us is that the models are wrong. And if you want, you can say, okay, generic Republican Eisenhower would have won given the current economy. But what it really is illustrating is just how bad a candidate Donald Trump is. That he should have won 55% of the vote and only, got less than Clinton, tells us that he's a terrible candidate. And why you can't see that, I don't know. Well, the models worked in the past for Obama, therefore they must work for Trump. Well,
okay.
The whole thing about models is you put it together, and that, if they're based on what has already happened, you can tinker it and pretty much get something that says, okay, my model correctly predicts what already happened because I'm using what already happened as the basis of my model. Well, what about predicting what's going to happen next? Okay, well, it still needs some tinkering.
Yeah,
there.
We'll see you after. I'll tell you how it went. So
that's on the good side for him, but it's so dumb. I don't even understand how people are looking at this and saying, okay, well, obviously he's the favorite. Because then you turn around and you look at the actual polling of what people actually think.
Yes.
Right? And so here's one by Ron Brownstein. Here's the next political truism that Trump might overturn.
Okay.
2020 election may test this never before, one of the most enduring rules of presidential politics, the straightforward four-word maxim coined by Democratic strategist James Carville in 1992, it's the economy, stupid.
Yes. Okay.
Right? But national surveys now routinely find a huge fall-off between the share of Americans satisfied with the economy and the percentage that approve of Trump's performance as president. And new academic research has concluded that attitudes about the economy were much less powerful in driving voters' decisions in 2016 and 2018 than their views about fundamental cultural and social changes, particularly race relations and shifting gender roles. Each of these dynamics underscores how the economy's role in politics may be shifting as the basis of each party's political coalition has evolved. Increasingly, the parties are bound together less by class than by culture. As I've argued, the fundamental dividing lines between the parties has become their contrasting attitudes toward the underlying demographic, cultural, and economic changes remaking American society. Democrats now rely primarily on what I've called, Ron Brownstein calls, the coalition of transformation centered on the groups that mostly welcome these changes, particularly young people, minorities, and college-educated white voters. All of them concentrated in major metropolitan areas. Republicans mobilize a competing coalition of restoration that revolves around the groups that are most uneasy about changes, older blue-collar, evangelical, and rural whites. Many political observers see clear evidence that attitudes toward these core questions of America's identity are overshadowing assessments of the economy and driving voters' decisions. Brian Schaffner, Tufts University political scientist, says a bad economy can still threaten a president and his party, as it did when the financial crash helped Barack Obama breeze to the presidency after Bush's 2 terms in 2008. But a good economy, he believes, may no longer be enough to dislodge the entrenched battle lines over those underlying cultural preferences. In other words, bad economies hurt you, good economies don't help you as much as they used to.
Okay. I can believe that.
One thing you see in the two most recent presidencies, the Obama and Trump presidencies, is neither of them got much credit for good economies. I'll have more on that. They had different ceilings of support, but they both had ceilings. And he goes on to point out the data that shows all of this. So, in other words, the political scientists who are actually looking at what voters do appear to have a leg up on the economists who, quite frankly, are a little bit out of their depth when they try to turn their expertise to politics.
Well, yeah. I mean, for a while it worked because it seemed like the economy was a great predictor, and then they didn't have to do anything else. They could also be predictors of elections as well as economists. It was easy
Right,
to
so
get a
let's just
second
use
job.
our models and let's just keep going. You know,
Yeah.
but things change.
Yes,
well,
they do.
But why should they change? You know, a dollar's a dollar, right? So why should anything change?
I don't know. Our friend Culture of Truth, Bob will speak on Twitter, reminded us that models do change, and Donald Trump loves walking in on models when they're changing. So
this is true.
This probably explains everything.
All right, so let me give you an idea of how models are simple and people are complicated.
Okay.
Right? New York Times Politics had this story. The shutdown of a General Motors plant in Lordstown, Ohio, where he worked for 25 years, has left him and many of his neighbors at sea politically. They tried voting for Obama, then Trump. Now they don't know where to turn. And it's a fascinating look at a plain old Joe the plumber, average kind of guy, working at a GM plant in Lordstown, which closed.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And as Seth Maskett, political scientist, notes, fascinating, this auto worker says saving the GM plant in his town is his top issue. He voted for Obama and gives Obama credit for saving GM.
Oh, okay.
4 paragraphs later, he says, nobody had our backs, not Democrats or Republicans, so we voted for Trump.
Oh, okay.
Okay? And Seth Maskett, the political scientist, looks at this and says, you know, we're generally not very good at providing a coherent rationale for a vote. There's no reason this person should be any better or worse than the rest of us. It's like trying to determine whether somebody's really a centrist. They often have extreme left views and extreme right views. They average together. It turns out to be a centrist. Actually, what they are is a complete fruit job nutcase.
It's a new one. Fruit job.
With you know, with
that is.
with opinions way out on the fringe, and it just sort of averages out to be like okay.
Yes.
You know, and people are like that. I mean, people are complicated. It's
there
not
are
so simple
millions
as,
of them.
oh, look at this model. The economy is X, therefore I'm going to vote for the president. No, that's not really how it works.
Not
and
often.
in fact, just to illustrate this point, there was an article from a year ago or so, 2 years ago, 2016, that I also found from the New York Times. Obama gets scant credit in Indiana region.
Yes.
Where recovery was robust.
See, people, I don't know.
Okay?
Sometimes they don't.
And the money quote there, but I think maybe it's just some of the other things he's been involved with. The people in our area. Mr. Thompson stopped, shaking his head in unspoken reference to various social issues.
Various social issues.
Otherwise known as economic anxiety, right?
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, this is just a perfect example of what we're talking about here. The fact of the matter is that people voted against Obama because he was black, because they were worried about their small towns changing. Right. There are plenty of reasons to be mad at Obama, but when in fact, I mean, this story, the second story about Indiana, this guy puts on armbands or wristbands, 3 or 4 of them. He says he's going to take off a wristband every time the unemployment rate drops by 5%, because it was something like 20% in this area.
Okay.
So he keeps taking off the wristbands.
Yeah.
And now he's not wearing any because the economy is doing much better. And of course, he's going to vote for the Republican.
Sure.
Because why?
I don't know.
Well, it's not got this lockstep attachment to the economy that the economic modelers think actually happens. And these two stories are great illustrations of what are you talking about?
All right. Yeah. I don't know. People just do this sort of thing.
They do. People are complicated.
Yeah, and millions of times over. I mean, it's probably a pretty rare person that actually, puzzles out. Certainly a rare person that would puzzle out an economic model and say, yeah,
let me go look
I'm
at the model
vote.
and see where I am, and that'll tell me where to
Yeah,
vote.
right. I mean, I've never met anybody that really works like that. I mean, there are people who sometimes say, I've decided, and when you ask me why I decided, as it turns out, some people have done some modeling that makes it look like I'm a well-read person, so I'll refer to those things, but yeah, I can't imagine anybody saying, unemployment was this and is that. All right, that's it. That's who I'm voting for.
Mm. So Jesse Lee points out on Twitter, brutal CRS report on Trump's only major accomplishment just came out. The GOP tax bill did almost nothing for growth. Rather than pay for itself, it paid for about 5% of itself. Almost all the corporate tax cuts went to buybacks and virtually nothing to wages, especially for the middle class.
Yeah. Oh, well.
It completely dismantles the idea that the GOP tax law was doing any good for the economy.
Yeah. Well,
those are the facts. But are people going to look at this and say, oh, well, the tax bill didn't help me, I'm voting for X? Again, that's not how it works. It's not that simple.
No. It never is.
That's why we do polling instead of predictions based on models as to how people would vote. We actually go out and ask people, who are you going to vote for?
That does seem more direct.
Right? And in those, Trump is not getting 56% of the vote. So let's look at the Democratic primary in the general election.
All right. Now?
Morning. There's a slew of polls that came out in the last day or so. Today is the 29th, and updated data on 5/28/2019 from Morning Consult, state of the Democratic primary. This is interesting because they look at it two ways. They look at Democratic primary voters nationwide, and then they have a subset of early primary states, which include just voters who live in Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, or Nevada.
Yes.
Would you like to look at that? I think that's more interesting, the early primary vote.
You know who loves that? Armando. Yes.
Does he?
He loves the fact that the early states get to decide everything for us.
Oh, well, then let's look at the other one.
Yeah.
In the early primary states, just kidding, Armando.
All right.
Early primary states, Joe Biden, 42%, Bernie Sanders, 20%, Pete Buttigieg, 7%, and Elizabeth Warren, 7%, tied for third. And in fifth, Kamala Harris at 5%. Everybody else is 3 or less.
Okay.
So those are the big 5.
They're lagging national polls. Okay.
All right. National polls for Democratic primary voters. Joe Biden, 38%, Bernie Sanders, 20%. So actually, Bernie's 20 in both, but Biden is 42 in the early states and 38 overall. Biden's actually doing better in the early states than he is in the general.
Yes.
But anyway, Democratic primary voters overall for the nation, Biden, Sanders, Elizabeth Warren in third at 9%, Pete Buttigieg at 7%, and Kamala Harris at 7%. So overall, Biden is actually doing quite well weeks after his announcement. Here's a piece from Mark Caputo in Politico. Biden dominates them rivals in new early primary polls. Previously unreleased surveys show the former vice president with huge leads in one-on-one matchups with the other top-tier candidates. And basically what he's looking at is New Hampshire and South Carolina. New Hampshire, open ballot, Biden 33, Sanders 12, Warren 11. I think New Hampshire's a must-win for Sanders. And so if Bernie doesn't do well in New Hampshire, I think it's over for him. In the head-to-head in New Hampshire, this poll has Biden 66, Sanders 22. So Bernie's getting crushed. These are just not good numbers of Bernie. In South Carolina, Biden 37, Sanders 10, Warren 8. And head-to-head, Biden 70, Sanders 15. Why am I mentioning the head-to-heads to Bernie? Because he's in second place.
Yeah. I have to. I chuckle when
Not
you say
on Bernie,
things
but,
are.
It's just the numbers aren't good for him.
Well, that he's the idea that Bernie Sanders is ever finished is like. I mean,
he's not going to be. He's not going to be finished, and his supporters won't think he's finished.
That's
They'll take it all the way to the very end. It won't matter.
It may not, and and then you can point back to it and say, well, it never got better than this, and so that's when you were finished. But yeah, as far as actually finishing. Well, all right.
Biden could collapse for a number of reasons.
Sure.
And so there's no reason to say this is the end result. But as a snapshot of where we are right now, I think anybody who's not named Joe Biden has to be rather unhappy with these polls. Now, here's a Michigan one. Good news for Trump. More than half of Michigan voters, 55%, are opposed to impeachment.
Okay.
Plus 29, white voters plus 31, Republicans plus 85, and voters in Macomb County plus 36. Significant opposition to the move, while younger voters plus 1, African Americans plus 60. African Americans are so smart. Democrats plus 47, and the city of Detroit plus 51 support impeachment.
Yeah.
That's where things stand in Michigan. Bad news for Trump. Donald Trump is losing by 10 points to a generic Democratic challenger.
That guy is generically great.
Suggesting that any of the 23 Democrats running against the incumbent would defeat him if the election were held today. I don't know that that's true for Andrew Yang or Tulsi Gabbard, but there it is. Mm-hmm. Biden 37, Sanders 16, Warren 9, Pete Buttigieg 5, Kamala Harris 4. So same 5 people always in front.
Okay.
Right, Cory Booker's got a 3. That's a good number for him. All the others less than 1%. And Bernie won Michigan, didn't he? If my memory serves me.
Mine doesn't. So sure, yeah, it was huge. Probably.
It was an upset.
Okay, yeah.
So,
sounds familiar.
Again, not great numbers for where he stands right at the moment.
Okay. Well, I don't know. Michigan, a bit of a mystery there. Where are all these people hiding? 55% opposed, huh?
Yeah. Anyway, when we get back from the break, which is coming up, we'll talk a little bit about Justin Amish.
Yes, he's still in the news, proving that it's a great way to get yourself in the news and get a lot of attention and publicity.
He's got a very erudite Twitter thing, and then he had this town hall where he got applauded.
Yeah, and you know how erudite statements go these days. It's worth about 7 to 9% in polls in the Democratic primary if you're erudite enough.
Well, according to the economic models, anyway.
Yes, right. So Justin Amish making a big splash with that stuff. He's doing very well with it. We'll see where it takes him. Hi, everybody. It's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com, and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Just got to update you on the internet's joke situation. As I was reading you or referring you to yesterday's Bobble Speak Culture of Truth joke about Trump walking in on models, Bill was cracking the exact same joke as I was getting ready to read it. It popped up just about, I noticed it right after I finished reading this other thing. So it's the great minds syndrome, spooky action at a distance here. And I guess it's occurring to all the wise crackers around the country. So congratulations to everyone. You must have been wondering, Bill, why did he get the attribution of that joke wrong? And, now I've corrected the record, and the rest of you are free to tweet it to me as well anytime during the next hour and a half.
So we're going to turn our attention to Justin Amish, who represents the 3rd District of Michigan. He is a Republican for the moment. He's been bandied about as a possible libertarian presidential candidate.
Sure, why not?
He called for Donald Trump's impeachment a month after the Mueller report came out because he said it took him a month to read and digest it.
It's probably about right.
He suggests in a town hall that he had yesterday, which was taped, and we saw excerpts of it, that many of his Republican colleagues agree with him, but just won't say so publicly.
That could be true of many people. I don't know how many people are. I mean, he's a sharp guy. I mean, I don't agree with him very often, and sometimes I think he's posturing. But I don't know how many Republicans there are in Congress who actually get what he's saying?
I think a lot of them.
Yeah, you think they get it?
Yeah, it's just that
They're
not that stupid.
There's
Some
almost
of them are that
200
stupid,
of them,
like Lou
so-
Gilbert, but they're not all that stupid.
I guess that's right. I'm thinking of the extreme examples.
It would take work not to get it because the evidence is so overwhelming.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we just don't hear from the bulk of Republicans are probably just, silently sitting there like idiots and I'm collecting a paycheck.
Yeah, what am I supposed to say?
Yeah, I don't know, but there are so many people who are just you're sure that they really don't get
the
it.
people who are on the Russian payroll are Dana Orbach and
sure.
Donald Trump, right? You think he doesn't get it? He gets it.
He might, or he might just be one of those people who's like, no, this is. I mean, I understand why you think it's bad, but it's not. It's good.
So Justin Amish was summarizing not the impeachment, which he did a few days ago.
Yeah.
But he's summarizing
Something
Attorney
else.
General William Barr.
Who should be impeached? So we should get to that too.
So
They can
this
both
is
be
really, really
impeachments.
good. He says Attorney General Barr has deliberately misrepresented key aspects of Mueller's report and decisions in the investigation, which has helped further the president's false narrative.
Yes.
After receiving Mueller's report, Barr wrote and released a letter on March 24th describing Barr's own decision not to indict the president for obstruction of justice. That letter selectively quotes and summarizes points in Mueller's report in misleading ways.
Yes.
Mueller's report says he chose not to decide whether Trump broke the law because there's an official DOJ opinion that's indicting a sitting president is unconstitutional, and because of concerns about impacting the president's ability to govern, preempting possible impeachment. Barr's letter doesn't mention these issues when explaining why Mueller chose not to make a prosecutorial decision. He instead selectively quotes Mueller in a way that makes it sound falsely, as if Mueller's decision stemmed from legal factual issues specific to Trump's actions. But in fact, Mueller finds considerable evidence that several of Trump's actions detailed in the report meet the elements of obstruction in Mueller's constitutional and prudential issues with indicting a sitting president would preclude indictment regardless of what he found. That's a pretty good summary.
Yes.
In noting why Barr thought the president's intent in impeding the investigation was insufficient to establish obstruction, Barr selectively quotes Mueller to make it sound as if his analysis was much closer to Barr's analysis than it actually was. Barr quotes Mueller saying the evidence didn't establish Trump was personally involved in crimes related to Russian election interference, and Barr then claims Mueller found the fact relevant to whether the president had the intent to obstruct justice. But Mueller's quote is taken from a section in which he describes other improper motives Trump could have had and notes, the injury to the integrity of the justice system is the same regardless of whether a person committed an underlying wrong. None of that is in Barr's letter.
Well, he had to keep it short.
And, it goes on for maybe 30 more tweets, but it's really, really good. And he says, ultimately, the special counsel recognized the president would not be interviewed voluntarily, chose not to subpoena him because of concerns that the resulting potentially lengthy constitutional litigation would delay completion of the investigation. Barr has so far successfully used this position to sell the president's false narrative to the American people. This will continue if those who have read the report do not start pushing back on his misrepresentations and share the truth. So he goes to his constituents back in Michigan in the 3rd District, gives a town hall, well attended. There's only 2 or 3 people who are dissenters who give him a hard time who are wearing MAGA hats. Mm-hmm. And Amish says, my job is not to represent my constituents, it's to uphold the Constitution.
Yeah, the competing model. Right.
Yeah. And it was pretty good. And he got a standing ovation for his efforts.
Okay. And then what happened?
Well, that was yesterday, so we don't know then what happened because it's only today.
Yeah, 9:30.
But one can go to your constituents and explain why you are doing what you're doing and have them approve it.
That is not possible.
Even though in places like Michigan, 55% don't want you to do this. Well, that means that a relatively high percentage in the 40s, mid-40s, do want you to do this, and that's way higher than the 19% that Nixon started at.
Yeah, I would say it's probably near record highs forever. I mean, there's not that often that they have to poll, should we impeach this current president? But when they do, and it's never been like that. It's far and away beyond anything anybody has ever seen for a sitting president.
Oh, by the way, Mike Musson just tweeted us that Michael Beschloss, the historian, says The Department of Justice has announced that Mueller will make statement about his investigation at 11 a.m. Eastern today.
Okay.
Whatever that means.
Yes, he'll come out and say, every fiber of my being doesn't want me to make any statement beyond this.
I was going to say, well, according to the economic models, Trump's going to be reelected, so, there's no point.
Yeah, right, exactly. So, lots of, I see everybody now flashing around, breaking, and so he's going to make a statement. I did read that it was out there earlier today. The thing that people were sharing was that it goes against every fiber of his being to give public testimony on things like this. And, I mean, I didn't realize that was really a thing. Like, I really don't want to rule it goes against the every fiber of my being to do a lot of things that you have to do each day. But, you find the fiber to do it.
Meanwhile, Donald Trump and Donald Trump Jr. are trying to publicly convince Roy Moore not to run for Senate again.
I wonder if they'll be able to do it.
The president just tweeted he has nothing against Roy Moore, a man accused of sexual misconduct with underage girls, says Kyle Griffin. And Steve Martin, the bluegrass guy, who also happens to be a comedian, said, well, he denied it, so good enough for Scrotus.
Well, yeah, I guess that'll probably do.
Yeah.
He could take that seat, too. There's somebody you could approve in an election year.
Right, exactly. And one last thing I'll leave you with before I leave for my segment today in electile dysfunction issues for Donald Trump. G. Elliott Morris, political scientist who writes for The Economist now, has a chart here based on Pew polling, how Donald Trump is exacerbating the GOP's problems with young voters in two charts.
Exacerbate that Pew poll.
And one word. That word is turnout.
Oh. All right. Yeah, that's a good one.
Did I give you that one? If I didn't, I don't think I did.
Word? You gave me the word.
I gave you the word.
Turnout.
So here's the actual chart. So it turns out that as of now, which wasn't true a couple of weeks ago. As of now. Gen X, Millennial, and Gen Z voters outnumber Boomer and prior generations.
Okay,
for the first time.
They're dead.
Well, the older generation is decreasing and the younger generation is increasing.
That's one way of putting it. So, but yeah, so Gen X through Z is that Z where we are now? Like the latest young?
We might starting to be with post Z, on beyond zebra.
Okay.
The on beyond zebra generation, but they're not quite ready to vote. The Gretas,
Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah.
Which, by the way, the Greens were the huge winners in the European elections. But the point for this discussion is that the younger voters are now starting to outnumber the older voters. But the second chart is perhaps the significant one. Millennial turnout nearly doubled from 2014 to 2018.
Okay.
From 2014 to 2018, millennial turnout nearly doubled.
Good. We need to drop the millennial thing.
42%. 30% for Gen Z, 55% Gen X, 53% all voters. The silence in boomers is still turning out at 64%. But there's less of them. There's more of the younger generation, and they're starting to show up.
Yeah, well, because they're getting older.
They're not just getting older. They're replaced by younger. And this climate thing and some other stuff that they see in Washington is actually driving them to go out and vote. Charlottesville and Parkland and things like that. There's a number of reasons why they are turning out, but they are turning out. They are reachable people. You can get them to the polls.
Yeah. All right. Well, young people today, the problem with young people today is that tomorrow they're old people.
Yeah. Well, that's tomorrow's problem. That's not today's problem.
Right. So Generation Z is
the whole
younger.
idea that, these young voters are all liberals, and as they get older, they come to their senses and become conservatives, may well not hold.
Oh, well, no.
And we'll see what happens, but it'll take a while for that. As of right now, however, again, whether it's turnout, whether it's 2016, 2018 results, whether it's polling, those economic models just aren't holding up. And that's my segment for today. And by the way, we'll be back tomorrow because tomorrow's Thursday. This is Greg Dworkin speaking with my good friend David Waldman. Kagro in the morning. Occasionally, I let him get a word in edgewise during my segment. I mean, it's his show. Why not?
I don't need it.
But it's traditional, so
Yeah,
we're big fans of traditions.
Economic models and whatnot.
Yeah, exactly right. Take care, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.
All right. Thanks very much, Greg. I appreciate it. We'll talk to you tomorrow. Today's segment Z, tomorrow segment Z1 or something like that. What are they going to do after that? I'm not certain. They're probably already working on it, unless that's the signal for us to stop labeling the generations, which would make a certain amount of sense. Anyway, I've lost track of which generation is which anyway. And I feel like we skipped a couple in between X and millennials. That can't really be the case, that there wasn't a generation in between. Could it? I don't know. Could it be? I lost track. As I said, I'm not too thrilled with the generational modeling. But I don't know. It's out there. And I guess if you're not going to write about soccer moms and security moms, and was there ever any dads out there? I guess those are just the white working class. They're all dads because there's no moms in the white working class, apparently. And I guess if you're shifting from that book sales model, you got to shift to the generational one instead. Okay, whatever. We'll see whether we can figure out. What's this? Something else happening? Did we have oh, wow. We had some sort of crashing going on for justice here. Not certain whether that kept us off of our one of several of our live streams. It's apparently working just fine somewhere, though, because everybody is a number of you are able to follow. I haven't seen any complaints otherwise, but I guess maybe something up with Daily Kos for justice there. So I can't get to the bottom of that one, but everyone's cracking wise about it. So I think the situation is well in hand at this point. Okay, let's see. Other things that have occupied time this morning made it to Twitter feed or Pocket for sharing in between our two segments today. Let's see. Let's add this one. I did see this one circulated yesterday, and also from the Lawfare blog, where we're turning with increasing frequency. Molly Reynolds and Margaret Taylor put this one together. We'll use this as important filler just to sort of discuss the procedural contours of impeachment. Going to stay on that topic because it's just not fading away. What powers does a formal impeachment inquiry give the House? Sort of a more in-depth look at the issues directly impacted by impeachment, adjacent to impeachment, and some fine-tuning around the margins of the general assumption that working in the impeachment context necessarily gives investigatory powers of the House an additional boost. It's a very good argument and a very good assumption generally that an impeachment, a formal impeachment inquiry, would persuade judges to view congressional powers to be at their constitutional zenith, as we sometimes say. But it's not necessarily the case in every situation, and of course, there's some nuance to it. And I think that this article may lay some of that out. It begins with basic backgrounder stuff that we can sort of move through, I think, relatively quickly. As the confrontation escalates between the House of Representatives and the White House over the production of documents, the appearance of witnesses, and compliance with congressional subpoenas, so too have calls for Democrats to initiate impeachment proceedings. And that's defined in many different ways, as you know, but using the I word seems to be important in most of them. Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, continues to push for further investigation of the president rather than an impeachment inquiry, while some members of her caucus and its leadership team and several candidates for the Democratic presidential nomination appear more willing to begin impeachment proceedings. There are a number of different ways to frame the decision that House Democrats must make as they move forward. First, impeachment is a fundamentally political phenomenon. A wide range of political goals and motivations bear on whether individual elected members of Congress see it as an appropriate path. The aggregation of those preferences, as filtered through party leaders with agenda-setting power, may or may not lead to the opening of an impeachment inquiry. Another framing focuses on the question of whether Congress has a responsibility to pursue impeachment, conveyed by the portion of the oath members take that requires them to, quote, faithfully discharge the duties of the office. A third framing, which we address here, is a more practical one, depending on your view of practicality, I guess, whether, for the purposes of carrying out further investigation, the House's hand would be strengthened significantly if it initiated impeachment proceedings. We've been over this ground, and like I said, generally the assumption is that it would, but it's not necessarily the only way to get where we're going. Not all judges will necessarily view it the same way, etc., etc. So it does bear some further consideration. So here we go. A May 15th letter from White House counsel Pat Cipollone to Gerald Nadler, chairman of the House Committee on the Judiciary, brings this question into stark relief. 12-page letter states, in essence, that the White House will not be providing any documents or information requested by the committee as part of an investigation announced on March 4th, quote, into the alleged obstruction of justice, public corruption, and other abuses of power by President Trump, his associates, and members of his administration, unquote. In its response, the White House outlines a host of political and legal arguments, relying heavily on the premise that Congress has, quote, has no, quote, legitimate legislative purpose, unquote, for requesting the materials. This sweeping repudiation, to say the least, of Congress's oversight powers brings into stark relief, didn't we already use stark relief? Brings into stark relief the question of whether there are procedural advantages in pursuing the same information and lines of inquiry under the banner of impeachment proceedings. Several experts have argued that the House might have a stronger legal position in disputes with the executive branch over information and witness appearances if it were undertaking impeachment proceedings rather than investigations. Michael Conway, who served as counsel on the House Judiciary Committee during the Watergate investigation, has advanced a similar argument. In particular, he points to a staff memo written in April 1974, which argues that, quote, the Supreme Court has contrasted the broad scope of the inquiry power of the House in impeachment proceedings with its more confined scope in legislative investigations. From the beginning of the federal government, presidents have stated that in an impeachment inquiry, the executive branch could be required to produce papers that it might withhold in a legislative investigation, unquote. Not really sure why presidents would have stated that, but apparently they did. Others are more skeptical, like Alan Barron, I don't know whether he says Barron, Alan Barron, or Alan Barron, a former attorney for the House Judiciary Committee on 4 judicial impeachments, who has cautioned that impeachment proceedings don't, quote, make all the problems go away, unquote. That's a very broad statement. It might actually have a hint of truth to it. It's probably, you're probably safe saying, well, it doesn't make all your problems go away, but what if it makes most of them go away? Certainly, as was suggested during our conversation, the authors, that is, on the Lawfare podcast last month, we would expect members to ask different kinds of questions during hearings if the goal is to establish a case for impeachment than if they are doing more general investigative work. But that is a separate issue from whether impeachment proceedings would meaningfully change the process members can use to obtain information in committee, the kind of material the committee could obtain, and the speed at which the committee would likely obtain it. The answer to those questions is, it depends. And that's usually the answer to most procedural questions. While several House committees are engaged in oversight work that could bear on an impeachment inquiry, the House Judiciary Committee, which would conduct impeachment hearings, at least that's the assumption, and it's a heavily favored assumption, they would almost certainly be conducting the main inquiry. I'm just not, I'll throw in at this point, I'm not 100% certain that there's anything that requires handing everything over to the Judiciary Committee and letting them take it from here. That is, that other committees couldn't complete their investigations. And even if they did hand over material that was meant to lead to articles of impeachment in the Judiciary Committee, that doesn't mean that their inquiry ceases at that point. But okay, Historically, the initiation of impeachment proceedings has had implications for the way the Judiciary Committee obtains relevant material. But broader changes in congressional rules and procedures in recent years mean that today's Judiciary Committee may not need the same kind of special powers it was granted as part of previous impeachment inquiries. The impeachment proceedings against both Presidents Nixon and Clinton began with a vote by the full House of Representatives directing the Judiciary Committee to investigate fully and completely whether sufficient grounds exist for the House of Representatives to exercise its constitutional power to impeach the president in question. In both cases, the resolution granted several specific powers to the committee for it to use in the course of completing the investigation with which it was charged by the full House. First, the authorizing resolutions outlined procedures for issuing subpoenas. Second, the measures laid out a process for taking staff depositions. Specifically, the Nixon and Clinton resolutions allowed subpoenas to be issued by the chairman and the ranking minority member, quote, acting jointly. If either declined to act, the individual proposing the subpoena could issue it alone, unless the other requested the issue be referred to the full committee for a vote. Alternatively, the full committee vote could be the first step in the process. As described in the 1998 report from the Judiciary Committee accompanying the authorizing resolution, this approach balances maximum flexibility and bipartisanship. That's the quote. It was important for the House to enhance the Judiciary Committee's subpoena powers in 1974 and 1998 because of the state of the chamber's rules at the time. In 1974, only a few House committees had subpoena power under the rules of the House, though other committees, including the Judiciary Committee, were granted subpoena authority through separate investigative authorizing resolutions reported from the House Committee on Rules in each Congress. As part of broader reforms to the committee system that took effect in 1975, the House provided all committees with subpoena power as part of the rules. In 1977, the House adopted a rule change that allowed individual committees to, if they wished, delegate the power to issue subpoenas to the chairman alone, without the need to consult the full committee. But in 1998, when the House commenced impeachment proceedings against Clinton, the Judiciary Committee had no such provision granting that authority to its chair. Indeed, until recent years, unilateral subpoena power was relatively rare for House committee chairs, but between the 113th and 114th Congresses, the number of chairs given this power by their committees doubled, and the Judiciary Committee was among them. The Judiciary Committee chair retains this authority in the current Congress. Its rules stipulate that, quote, a subpoena may be authorized and issued by the chairman following consultation with the ranking minority member, unquote. And while Chairman Gerald Nadler indicated in January of 2019 that he would hold votes on any subpoenas to which ranking member Doug Collins objected, the rules do not specifically require that he do so. The need to seek full House authorization for expanded subpoena powers as a part of an impeachment inquiry, then, is not as pressing as it was in 1974 or 1998. There has been a similar evolution in the rules surrounding depositions taken by committee staff, which allows committees to pursue additional information without imposing on members' time and in a private setting that may be more likely to produce candor from witnesses. Under practices in place in 1974 and 1998, deposition power for committee staff was periodically authorized by the full House for the purpose of specific investigations. The resolutions authorizing both the Nixon and Clinton impeachment proceedings granted the Judiciary Committee this authority. Since 1998, however, the rules of the House governing staff depositions have evolved to give committees access to the tools more regularly. In 2007, The House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform was given the ability to set its own rules, quote, authorizing and regulating the taking of depositions by a member or counsel of the committee, unquote. In 2015, the House gave 4 committees, they were Energy and Commerce, Financial Services, Science, Space and Technology, and Ways and Means. Those 4 committees got the ability to conduct staff depositions. This power was initially granted for the first session of the Congress, but later was extended to the second session as well. Under the subsequent rules issued by the House Committee on Rules for the Conduct of such depositions, quote, at least one member of the committee shall be present unless the witness to be deposed agrees in writing to waive this requirement. In 2017, the rule permitting staff depositions was extended to cover almost all standing committees, and the member attendance requirement was modified such that it did not apply if the committee authorized the staff deposition to take place when the House was not in session. So small changes to the rules here over time, but you can see also just by, I guess, that last example that comes from the rules changes adopted in 2017, that is to say, under the new Democratic majority. I guess that's some good news, just in terms of those of us who worry that the Democrats entered into things kind of unprepared to do the sort of oversight that was going to be necessary for Trump. I guess this speaks to a different situation. That in January of 2017, even before taking the gavel, the Speaker and House leadership were cognizant of the need to extend the ability to conduct staff depositions to almost all committees, because there were going to be dozens of them probably involved in investigations of Trump. It hasn't pushed them any further towards impeachment per se, but it's been different. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Nervous Radio. Got to correct an error here. Yeah, I blurred out there for a second. The next paragraph discusses rules changes made in January 2019. That, of course, would be the opening of the Democratic House, not 2017. Still a Republican House in 2017. But I guess what is getting overlooked in this discussion, or at least looms in the background and hasn't been mentioned explicitly, is the expansion of investigatory powers in the last couple of years prior to 2018 elections has probably largely been driven by the Republican House's mania for Benghazi-type investigations and the expansion of the investigatory powers of the committees of the House was due to their interest in using it as a gotcha mechanism to trap either, as a way to embarrass President Obama or trap Hillary Clinton in the run-up to the election and beyond. And now those rules sit in the hands of Democrats, and Republicans are worried about that, and rightly should be, even though they complain all the time about any rules changes proposed by Democrats coming back to haunt them. Apparently that never occurs to them that their rules changes may come back to haunt Republicans. Anyway, moving forward to January of 2019, the opening day rules package for the 116th Congress again provided committee chairs with the authority to order the taking of a deposition. Under the current rules, either a member or committee counsel is permitted to do so. Members may participate, but their presence is not required, so the Judiciary Committee already has the power to conduct staff depositions and does not need a special grant of authority to do so. So far, most of the argument has been that moving under the formal impeachment umbrella, it doesn't do very much necessarily to enhance the procedural, what shall we say? To enhance the rules under which Congress can conduct its inquiries procedurally. the mechanics of it. So far, they haven't really addressed, and maybe this will come up in the rest of the article if we can get to it, the impact that operating in an impeachment environment might have on decisions made by judges being asked to make the call on, I guess, the question of whether or not there's legitimate legislative interest in getting sensitive information, information that either is classified or falls under Rule 6E or is otherwise, or the president is making some attempt to shield by executive privilege or some other privilege. But this is an important aspect. It's not really the aspect of the question that has been argued, as far as I've seen, in public. Most of the discussion has been about what impact operating as an impeachment inquiry would have on judges making decisions about subpoenas and witness testimony, as opposed to how the Congress will elicit information from people that they have subpoenaed. But that is important too, and you can't forget that step. It's actually thinking a step or two ahead of what happens after the judges rule. So, we'll continue on with this. Yet, while today's Judiciary Committee already has some of the useful powers for impeachment proceedings available, it could pursue additional procedural items if the House chooses to specifically authorize impeachment. For example, under a resolution introduced by Representatives Rashida Tlaib and Al Green directing the Judiciary Committee to, quote, inquire whether the House of Representatives should impeach, unquote, President Trump, the power to take depositions and affidavits would be extended to, quote, any subcommittee or task force designated by the Judiciary Committee, unquote. And depositions could be taken by consultants, as they say here in quotes, as well as members and staff. The Tlaib-Green resolution also provides for additional funding for the Judiciary Committee in the context of an impeachment inquiry. And it is noted in parentheses here, the 1974 resolution authorized the committee to use its existing resources on the investigation. And while funding was not addressed specifically in the 1998 resolution, there had been an earlier dispute in the 105th Congress about whether additional resources allocated to the committee were meant to prepare for possible impeachment. It is worth noting that in both 1974 and 1998 impeachment proceedings, the House Judiciary Committee voted to give the president procedural rights in the committee's deliberations. The president and his counsel were invited to attend all executive session and open committee hearings, and the president's counsel was entitled to cross-examine witnesses, make objections regarding the pertinence of evidence, and respond to the evidence produced, and even suggest additional evidence the committee should receive. Attorney James D. St. Clair represented Nixon before the House Judiciary Committee during the impeachment proceedings, essentially arguing that Nixon's statements looked bad but were not criminal. Although St. Clair was not a government employee and was acting as Nixon's private attorney, he insisted at the time that he was representing the office of the presidency rather than Nixon personally. I don't represent Mr. Nixon personally. I represent him in his capacity as president, is the quote. He made his final arguments before the House Judiciary Committee in July of 1974 as it prepared articles of impeachment against Nixon. During the House Judiciary Committee's proceedings to consider impeachment of Bill Clinton in 1998, Clinton's private attorney, David Kendall, questioned independent counsel Kenneth Starr for an hour. The current Judiciary Committee would not be bound by precedents to afford the president these same procedural rights, but committees often adhere to precedents unless there is a good reason to deviate, and so far that's been Nadler's practice on almost everything. Where there's precedent, you stick to it, is his view. One can imagine President Trump sending Attorney General William Barr, White House counsel Pat Cipollone, White House special counsel Emmett Flood, or his personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, to the House impeachment proceedings to take full advantage of such rights in televised proceedings. He could even show up personally. I would not recommend that for him as an attorney, but what the hell? As a constituent, I say go for it. So, while impeachment proceedings do not unlock significant new procedural avenues for the Judiciary Committee, they could, in theory, afford the president more opportunities to inject himself or his lawyers into the spotlight. Or, of course, they could specifically prohibit that. But, again, I don't think this addresses most of our questions about things, at least not so far. Impeachment proceedings may also give the Judiciary Committee a stronger case for obtaining certain materials. Here we go. Protected from disclosure by statute, like the grand jury materials from Special Counsel Robert Mueller's investigation. Under Rule 6E of the Federal Rules of Criminal Procedure, certain people, including the government attorneys presenting the case, involved in a grand jury proceeding, must not disclose a matter occurring before the grand jury. There are certain exceptions in the statute that would allow a judge to authorize disclosure for certain specified purposes, including, quote, preliminary to or in connection with a judicial proceeding, unquote. And we've been through the logic of how that gets extended to cover impeachment proceedings in the House as well. As we wrote on Lawfare last month, they say, there is some historical precedent for the House Judiciary Committee to obtain such information from the court, most notably in the context of the Watergate impeachment proceedings. The relevant court opinion relied largely on a theory of inherent judicial authority rather than an exception in statute to turn the Watergate roadmap over to the House Judiciary Committee. Of course, these days, the inherent judicial authority theory is in some doubt, I guess, at least among certain of the D.C. Circuit judges, as they mention here. On April 5th, the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit ruled that judges don't have inherent authority to release grand jury materials and must instead rely solely on exceptions outlined in Rule 6E. So, if the committee wishes to access that information, Nadler will likely need to convince the judge overseeing the Mueller grand jury that release of materials to the committee is, quote, preliminary to or in connection with a judicial proceeding, unquote. Bottom line, it is easier to argue that an open impeachment proceeding is akin to a judicial proceeding than it is to argue that any run-of-the-mill oversight activities are preliminary to a judicial proceeding. There are also important questions about whether impeachment proceedings would produce compliance with congressional subpoenas, either by the executive branch or the courts. The White House's principal justification for its current stonewalling strategy for ongoing House investigations would not be relevant in the context of impeachment. On April 24th, the president told reporters, quote, we're fighting all of the subpoenas, unquote, and Cipollone's May 15th letter supplies various legal arguments in support of this approach. First, the letter relies heavily on the argument that there is no legitimate legislative purpose for the request. Congress's general investigative powers are derived from its power to legislate. Whatever the merits of this argument, it would simply not be relevant in the context of impeachment proceedings because the power to impeach is contained in an entirely separate and discrete section of the U.S. Constitution. Second, the letter argues that even if a legitimate legislative purpose can be articulated, committees have limited authority to explore in detail any particular case of alleged wrongdoing because Congress does not need such details in order to craft legislative fixes. Again, this would likewise not be relevant in the context of impeachment hearings. I don't even know if it would necessarily do you any good in regular legislative hearings either. I don't think that's actually a valid argument, that you don't need to explore any particular case in detail. Of course you do, particularly if it's the one motivating the legislation and the legislative change. Anyway, the decision of whether to impeach requires the development of a detailed, backward-looking factual record of specific conduct by the president. While it is, of course, possible the White House could come up with different theories for stonewalling in the context of an impeachment hearing, these two arguments would fall away, leaving only arguments related to executive privilege to be made before the courts. Beyond the substance, it's unclear whether courts would consider and decide such cases more quickly in the context of impeachment proceedings than similar cases pursued under the Congress's investigative authority. One district court judge expedited consideration of one of the current investigative impasses, the House Oversight and Reform Committee's request for Trump's financial and accounting records from Mazars, and ruled in favor of the committee. Trump has already appealed the case, and it is unclear how long this appeal and similar appeals will take. Moreover, the case does not involve any claims of executive privilege. Sorting out the scope of executive privilege is the most thorny and time-consuming issue in cases involving congressional requests for information from the executive branch. We think it is entirely possible, probable even, that judges would recognize the primacy of impeachment proceedings against the President of the United States and expedite consideration of such cases. The case of U.S. v. Nixon, in which the Supreme Court ruled that the President had to turn over the infamous Oval Office recordings to the special prosecutor, was decided just over 3 months after the relevant grand jury subpoena had been issued. That was a criminal investigation, so the analogy is not entirely apt, but we think it reasonable to assume courts would take a similarly expeditious view in the context of a subpoena issued pursuant to impeachment proceedings. Of course, it's worth remembering that the Supreme Court has never decided a case concerning a congressional subpoena for information issued to an executive branch official where the president has asserted an executive privilege. In theory, the Supreme Court could decide the issue is a political question and leave it to the other two branches to sort out in some other way. What House Democrats ultimately choose as a course of action remains to be seen. Recent comments from Pelosi about how President Trump may self-impeach are open to several different interpretations about where Democratic leaders are headed. The uncertainty at hand isn't just a matter of politics, it's also a matter of information. What members of Congress would get and how they would get it. And that's actually the conclusion of the piece. Again, worth going over because of the details. And this article does, I think, an excellent job at delineating all of the different issues and reminding us that the Mazars case is different from the Deutsche Bank case, which is different from the grand jury materials case, which is different from the tax returns case. All stand on slightly different grounds, but are in some ways analogous to one another. And also a good reminder that even though an impeachment inquiry might color the way a court views the power of a congressional subpoena, and in one of, we'll view it at least in one of these 3, 4, 5 different ways. I guess the question of how you even get to that subpoena was up in the air at some point, and I guess really the big takeaway from this piece, while important for background, I guess really if you're trying to get down to the nitty gritty a lot faster, the basic takeaway really is, well, opening an impeachment inquiry doesn't do very much in terms of increasing the power of members of Congress through their various committees to make the demands that go into a subpoena. The authorization that is required in order to issue a congressional subpoena is much easier to come by under current House rules than it used to be. And so I guess the general statement that operating in an impeachment atmosphere has historically afforded the committees in Congress and the staff of those committees and individual chairs and members of those committees additional powers. Historically, that's been true, but it was true of necessity, and it was something that was answered by resolutions empowering the Congress or laying out procedural powers for the conduct of that impeachment inquiry. And most of those expanded powers have stuck around outside of the impeachment context as general powers available now outside of the context of impeachment to many more committees and many more committee staffers. So, although it was necessary you might otherwise look at the record and say, well, in 2 previous presidential impeachments, there was a formal step taken to adopt a resolution that empowered these committees to do the investigating that they're doing, and so we ought to therefore do the same now. The answer is no, that wouldn't be necessary. Of course, unfortunately, it's not that unfortunate, but what it tells us is that the Congress and its committees, the House and its committees, are prepared to do this work right now, and yet the complaint is that they haven't moved fast enough or haven't done enough. And so I guess at the very least, what you can take away from this is if you ever run into a member of Congress who is reluctant to endorse impeachment because they, or they say, well, we haven't gotten there yet. We haven't developed the record to that point where the majority of the public is ready for it. And it's very difficult to do that because we're being stonewalled at every turn, or it's very difficult to issue the subpoenas that you need to issue in order to initiate the litigation process that will eventually lead to the vindication of those subpoenas. At least that we've now learned, no, that's not the case. You're thinking of the old model wherein in 1974 and 1998, specific authorization was necessary in order to authorize the Judiciary Committee to conduct these inquiries, and that authorization still exists and pre-exists at this point anyway, now pre-exists any resolution calling for an impeachment inquiry. It's not necessary. You can go directly to it, as evidenced by the fact that you have. So I don't know who would throw that argument in your face, but you never know. I think it's worth being prepared, largely because, well, as you know, I'm not that happy with the one statement, which others have pointed out we don't know about necessarily the accuracy of it. But it's been a week now, and I don't think Nancy Pelosi has done anything to deny that she originally asserted that other investigations in other committees besides the Judiciary Committee would have to shut down if we were to move into impeachment mode. I think that was a bad move. I view that, as I said, as bullying. The idea that somebody who's presumed to have a stronger command of the procedural rules of the House would tell subordinate members of the House, not to mention the public, that some adverse effect would be required by some arcane provision of the rules if we were to move immediately to an impeachment footing. I think that's when you do that, knowing that it will shut down debate, at least temporarily, and that people will feel unsure of themselves in pushing back against that, I'd equate that to bullying. I was very disappointed to see that. But like I said, other people said, well, we don't know that she actually said it that way. We don't know whether the quote was correctly relayed. It's a secondhand report. It's true, but I haven't seen it denied since. So I think that probably speaks volumes about its likely accuracy. It felt quite like something that she might say, something that she might want to take back at some point. But I think it was offered up as an obfuscation, and she was glad to do so at the time, and she thought it was going to get her out of a tight spot. It may have landed her in a different one instead. All right. Well, anyway, let's see. Other things that we could discuss here, and keep an eye out for Joan as we approach our third break. It's sometimes, it's sometimes her practice, or I don't know if it's practice or it's just coincidence. She manages to wrestle free of the demands of the front page at about the same time each Wednesday. Sometimes that's immediately before we break. Sometimes it's during the break. But we'll keep an eye out for her on that front coming up soon. Let's see. Other things we can discuss here. Let's see. Lots of different directions to go. Lots of different things we can think about. Here's a slightly different story from our usual beat, but one that's worth keeping an eye on. Bloomberg Law reporting this one Who is our author here? Where's the byline on this? The person has every right to be upset that their name isn't prominently displayed. There we are. Oh, it is prominently displayed. It's just in a format I didn't recognize. Ben Penn. That's a real name. Ben Penn. Not Ben 10 from the cartoons, but Ben Penn, Penn, is the reporter here. And really, I'd go with Benjamin on that one, but I guess he's enjoying it. He looks happy in his photo there, so I guess he's okay with it. Mulvaney. Mick Mulvaney. Remember that guy? He has every job in the world. Mulvaney tightens grip on labor chief after Trump allies grumble. It's a hell of a headline. It's a weird one. We're going to have to figure it out. By the way, he's still listed as White House acting chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney. I don't know when, if ever, he'll become regular chief of staff, or whether there's any advantages keeping him acting, but okay. What's up here? President Donald Trump's acting chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney, has seized power. And so he's really acting. He's acting out as chief of staff. He's seized power over the Labor Department's rulemaking process. Out of frustration with the pace of deregulation under Labor Secretary Alexander Acosta, according to current and former department officials and other people who communicate with the administration. I guess Alexander Acosta, distracted in part by the necessity of continuing to defend Jeffrey Epstein somehow, or at least his actions in that case, and not moving to deregulate fast enough, even though something, and the president brags about the pace of deregulation all the time. Upon arriving at the West Wing in January, Mulvaney instituted a formalized system for settling regulatory policy, and timeline disputes between White House assistants and Acosta's top aides, said people with direct knowledge of the process. So even in January, they were upset with this guy. Conflicts are elevated to Mulvaney for a final decision, said one official with direct knowledge. Acosta and his staff have been losing these decisions so often that they've stopped bothering to appeal, said current and former DOL officials. That's interesting. I don't know whether that was by design or just has happened, but it's interesting that it would dawn on even insiders to the Trump cabinet that there's really no point in arguing from a rules-based perspective with the Trump White House. They're simply going to do what they want to do, and the rules be damned. Too bad. Welcome to the world. This has led to an acceleration of previously languishing rules on overtime pay, job training, and workplace safety that businesses have sought during the first 2 years of Trump's administration. The White House intervention also signals more contentious regulations, such as rules to bolster union oversight or restrict workers from taking medical leave, could now be in the pipeline at a department that appears less likely to embody its secretary's risk-averse style for the remainder of Trump's presidency. Acosta wasn't really interested in getting those rules done until Mick Mulvaney started taking over, and then everything started moving at the department because Mulvaney doesn't mess around, a former Trump administration official said, referring to deregulatory actions across DOL. When Mulvaney took over, they started scrambling to try and make up for lost time. The Labor Department declines to comment on internal administration processes, an agency spokesperson said in a statement. Next section here, Acosta under the gun. Mulvaney's keen interest in labor policy comes at a time when the secretary's position in Trump's orbit is weakened by rekindled public outrage over a decade-old plea deal Acosta reached as South Florida prosecutor with billionaire and accused sex trafficker Jeffrey Epstein. A federal judge recently ruled that Acosta and others broke the law by keeping Epstein's accusers, including girls as young as 13, in the dark about the 13-month prison deal that allowed Epstein to escape prosecution for federal sex trafficking offenses. The Justice Department's Office of Professional Responsibility has also launched an investigation. But the real source of the Mulvaney-Acosta tension was complaints relayed to Mulvaney by White House aides shortly after he became acting chief of staff that Acosta and his advisors were slow-walking rules and misleading the White House about the agency's progress toward meeting the president's repeated promise to remove, quote, job-killing regulations. In other words, I guess Acosta was one of the many White House aides and White House, cabinet members as well, ignoring Trump's orders for things, which Trump denied was ever happening. Mulvaney inserted himself as an arbiter at a lower profile cabinet agency, DOL, I guess, despite already juggling numerous other responsibilities, which is the most famous thing about Mick Mulvaney, I think. We'll be back with more after this. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, with a brand new interruption to say thanks to all of you who support the show. Remember when I told you that our average monthly donation was about $7, for which you were getting 2 great hours of news and entertainment 5 days a week, and how that came out to about 70 cents an hour? That's a pretty good deal, except it's wrong. The math actually works out closer to 17 cents an hour. It is hard to beat a deal like that, and even harder to send your kids to college on. Thankfully, Patreon.com makes it easy to make that work. Patreon, Patreon.com, is the simple, secure way to make recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Just search for me or the show name on the site, and they make it easy to crowdfund the show so that the power of our numbers can keep the show going for just a few bucks a month. Once again, thanks so much for all your support. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Roots Radio. Let's see, got a couple of things I wanted to sneak in here before we continue with the article. First of all, what occurred to me, I should have done this up at the top before we began on the article. And I think we corrected it. I sent a correct link to Scott yesterday in putting together the recap, but I didn't call out the error in the recap specifically. But I was scrambling at the end of yesterday's show to find the constitutional authority that Ken Cuccinelli thought he was leaning on. Remember yesterday's story that he was saying that states should invoke their own war powers in the immigration fight, which is a very, it's just legally dubious place to be insofar as the Constitution is pretty explicit, I think, about the inability of states to operate in the immigration field. That's exclusively a federal field. But he was adopting the view that immigration was an invasion, which is a highly dubious logical leap, to say the least. And in his view, states retained war powers that you would think really a closer reading of the Constitution elsewhere really eliminates from the hands of the states. But flipping through the Constitution, I was trying to just sort of find that thing, and I knew, I'm like, all I could remember was it's at the very end of one of the articles. Which one is it? And it seemed like the sort of thing that would appear late in the Constitution, and indeed there was a Article 4, Section 4 reference to invasion, but that was simply the United States guaranteeing a Republican form of government to all the states and protect each of them against invasion, which is supposed to, I think, exclude the states' rights in terms of repelling invasions as a general matter, which becomes important when you then flip back to the constitutional provision he was actually talking about, which again does come at the end of an article, except it's the end of Article 1. Article 1, Section 10, like again, very end of Section 10, which I guess would be Clause 3 here. No state shall, this is first starts out as a prohibition. See, no state shall, without the consent of Congress, lay any duty of tonnage, there's our tariffs again, keep troops or ships of war in times of peace, enter into any agreement or compact with another state or with a foreign power, and here, or engage in war, right? So there are no state war powers unless actually invaded or in such imminent danger as will not admit of delay. So there, of course, the logical leap is very important. Well, immigrants are an invasion. Well, they're really not. Well, I think they are. Well, that might not be enough. But if that was enough, then I would say states actually have the ability to, it's one of the exceptions to the general prohibition that states alone shall engage in war. Of course, somebody might then argue, yeah, well, reading that in conjunction with Article 4, Section 4, which makes it explicitly, pretty explicitly, the role of the federal government to protect states against invasion. Basically, the idea, I guess the interplay there was, well, it's the obligation of the United States to protect states from invasion, but if for some reason federal troops will be otherwise too late in arriving, then yes, of course, in an emergency, a state can act on its own with whatever resources it might have on hand to repel invasion. But, I guess it has to be pretty clearly an invasion, and it really isn't at this point. Anyway, I just thought I would throw that in there and make sure that we got that correction underway. And Joan has joined us here, thankfully, so that gets us out of having to continue with the Mulvaney story, though it's a very interesting one, and we might have to go back to it in full sometime later in the week. But I guess the quick and dirty is always keep an eye on Mick Mulvaney. And I guess not terribly surprising that Mick Mulvaney would have to intervene for somebody as low profile and, generally speaking, I think lazy as Alexander Acosta. So, it's just very interesting. And I guess...
intervening for or intervening against?
Intervening against, but intervening, I guess, in the role that Alexander Acosta probably should have anticipated he was going to have to take when he made his deal with the devil. His second deal with the devil. I'm sorry. The first deal with the devil was for the perv in Florida, and the second one was for the other perv in Florida. There's a lot of pervs in Florida that he's got good deals with. The first one
gets easy.
Yeah, I guess so. Right. So is the tough one. Yeah, right. First, you just got to get over making deals with Floridian pervs or whoever. But yeah, after Epstein, I guess it's all downhill from there. Oh, sure, I could make a deal with Trump, no doubt. So yeah, I guess he was one of the guys. I don't know whether he had active opposition to any of these changes. They try to paint him in the light of being a risk-averse guy. But it might just be that he thought, I don't have to do anything in this job.
Are you reading the Bloomberg Law story?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, okay, so you've seen that one. It's
briefly.
Yeah. Well, it's pretty interesting, and I guess just interesting to watch Mulvaney seize power even as an acting, whatever that means, chief of staff. What's the holdup in that? You don't need any congressional approval for that, do you, chief of staff? I don't think so.
No.
So
it's all up to Trump and to Mulvaney.
So what's he being so lazy about? I
don't know. This is a weird one because I don't think it's a matter of Trump feeling like this is one of the people he has to keep on edge.
Yeah, I don't...
You get the sense that Mulvaney is perfectly happily ensconced there.
Yeah.
Feels very comfortable controlling things.
I'm not sure. I guess the only reason I can think of is if Trump were at some point to decide that he needs to move Mick Mulvaney to a 19th job...
it would be easier if he was only acting?
Then I don't think it would be any easier procedurally, but it would mean that when the press writes, this is Trump's 5th chief of staff or whatever it would be, he would say, no, it's my 3rd because, 16 of them were acting chiefs of staff and that doesn't count or whatever. But I don't see why he would bother with that or why such a thought, an organizing thought like that would occur to him. But maybe he would be able to push back on the somewhat bad publicity of being the president who's had way too many chiefs of staff because he can't keep one because he's terrible. And he could say, well, one less.
Yeah.
I don't know. But otherwise, there's really no real reason. Unless it's just like, I don't know. Well, it doesn't change anything for me if you make me real chief of staff or keep me as acting. All the power remains with me. Nobody disputes me. So let's just do it for trolling purposes so that people get angry that there's still no chief of staff. And
that's as likely as anything between the two of them, Mulvaney and Trump. Yeah.
Maybe. I don't know.
Trolling is definitely a possibility.
Well, yeah, that's about the only other thing I can think of. Anyway, it's a very interesting story in the sense that, Acosta under the gun again, and I guess he cares enough about keeping the job that now he's basically running around scrambling to hurt workers as often as possible and now as quickly as possible. His original inclination was not to, and now he's going to do it with gusto.
Yeah.
Okay. I guess we figured that was coming.
Well, and, you knew Mulvaney was going to speed up the Freedom Caucus-y kind of things.
That's all he
when
does.
He got there, because,
Our
that's
quiet
what
Mulvaney.
he does. He destroyed the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau as acting director.
See?
And now he has
something.
way more power to do it.
Yeah. All right, well, we'll see what other cabinet departments, if any, he feels like he has to call to heel next. I guess if Epstein runs the Department of Labor, that would be a big change, I think. But if Acosta falls in line, I guess he can move on to the next department. And if he doesn't fall in line, I guess he fires
it's not going to be HHS because they're doing a fine job of destroying everything without him.
Yeah, I don't know what else they...
Same with the VOS at Education.
Yeah. Seems to be okay.
Carson at HUD.
Yeah.
I don't know. There has been a lot of movement at HUD. Not necessarily Department of Education, but certainly at HUD. It could be Mulvaney lighting a fire under Carson, too.
Yeah, I guess. Could be. I don't know what he's doing, but I thought the game plan was to do less there. But, and that maybe the woman that they have installed, the party planner that they put in Region 2, who doesn't care about the Hatch Act, I think, was her big weekend activity. Maybe she's doing whatever deregulatory work they need done. After that, I don't know. I mean, Rick Perry we haven't heard from in a while.
In the last 2 weeks, kicking migrant children,
right?
U.S. citizen children of migrant undocumented workers out of housing.
Well, they shouldn't have chosen those parents, should they?
Right. And transgender protections.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
So I guess they're getting their mileage out of that.
Now. 55,000 children could be kicked out of housing.
Sounds Trumpian.
And transgender homeless people can be kicked out of shelters.
What would they need shelter for?
Can't imagine.
Yeah. All right. Well, so he seems to be performing on that front, unless they want that to happen faster or they want to kick out many more classes.
And here's the thing. It did take them this long to get around to doing it, so it's possible Mulvaney had something to do with pushing that along.
I guess. It's unusual even that... I guess so. Yeah, somebody must have pushed something because it's not a problem that occurs to certainly most Trump people in their daily lives. I wonder what's going on in those homeless shelters. I'm worried about that. How could that occur to them? So, I don't know. All right, well, interesting story. Worth keeping an eye on. And that among many things worth keeping an eye on. I'm
sorry I wasn't able to listen this morning. Have we talked about McConnell?
Yeah, we have to a certain extent, but you're certainly welcome to reopen that issue. Of course, I would want to hear from you on that one.
My obsession, Mitch McConnell and his destruction of every norm, every institution, everything that matters.
Yes, that's why you're here. Sure, of course. I mean, you've been saying it every time. Without fail, and so now we have a huge story on the line. Yeah, by all means.
Did you watch the video of his answer last night?
I didn't watch the video. I didn't see the description of people being annoyed with. I guess he smirked, and they made a particular.
He smirked. It's rather enraging.
Yeah, I can imagine.
The sly look he gets on his face when he gets the question, which was probably planted. It was a friendly crowd. It was Chamber of Commerce.
Yeah, they all had a good time with the answer. They laughed. It was funny.
They
Destruction
laughed.
of norms.
How clever.
Yeah. Which, take note that the Chamber of Commerce is laughing it up and whooping and cheering for the destruction of norms. Just Not really where you thought the Chamber of Commerce was going to land, because remember, something, business, consistency, planning, they love that.
Yeah.
But
Maybe it's just the Paducah Chamber.
Could
Maybe
be.
they don't speak for the rest of the chamber.
Oh, maybe, yeah, I guess that's a possibility. Or just, the Chamber has been Gimmitarian also since forever, and just says, well, what we're really, it's not that it's going to benefit us per se that we back this, it's just we want consistency. We want to win all the time. That's the consistency we're looking
And
for.
that they will, and then that's what McConnell promised them.
Yeah. Yep.
Saying flat out why we're doing this, because installing his kind of people in the judiciary is the best way to have a, quote, long-lasting positive impact.
Yes.
Positive.
Well, yeah. If you're him, you think it's a positive thing. Yeah, so it's pretty obvious, and I don't know, I guess I was surprised that people thought of it as a surprise. There was that.
Yes.
And then I guess, I don't know. Do we think that...
Well, and then you get Politico and their savvy, smart, insidery morning consult, whatever they call the thing. The morning playbook?
Who knows?
Playbook.
Yeah.
Yes, they call it playbook.
Playbook, because...
For sport.
Yeah.
And their take, you might not like it, and they say, yeah. Y-A. Yeah.
Yeah.
You might not like it.
I might not.
This is broadly consistent with where McConnell has been on the issue. And then they pull up an old quote from 2016 on the Mary Garland thing.
Yeah.
You'd have to go way back to 1888 when Grover Cleveland was in the White House to find the last time a vacancy created in a presidential year was confirmed by the party opposite of the occupant of the White House. Yeah.
Okay.
Because a lot of times there isn't a vacancy in the final year of a presidential term.
Right.
So maybe you have to go all the way to 1888 to find it even happening. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, how far back do you have to go to find...
It's fine with Politico. Completely normal. Everything that Mitch McConnell is doing is just Mitch McConnell being Mitch McConnell. Playing that game.
I mean, is they're essentially saying... he's being consistent in his deviousness? Is that all that he's consistent in?
He's being consistent in his, this is completely historical, normal. There's precedent for this.
I see. I guess if you...
That's how I read it, because I hate
gotcha.
Politico.
I think that could be it. Right. So if you consider there to be some validity to the wild notion of, well, you have to go back to 1888 to find precedent for this or whatever. Well, that means it's a long-standing
Or you could go to the
thing.
Constitution.
Yeah, well, that's even older. It's from 17-something or what? I don't know. I'm not sure what their complaint is, but yeah, I mean, how far back do you have to go to find precedent for a Supreme Court justice dying on a hunting trip? Is that relevant in some way, or under a pillow, or I don't know. I mean, what kind of thing is that? As you point out, it's a little bit dumb, and it's a very specific circumstance. And even so, what did happen in 1888? And what was his assertion, that they didn't confirm this justice, or?
Let's see.
I don't even know what he was arguing.
Grover Cleveland, to find the last time a vacancy created in a presidential year was confirmed by the party opposite the occupant of the White House.
Yeah, and then the implication is that it didn't really happen again since
so
then.
You can only confirm a justice in the last year, and this is important, in the last year of a president's term before re-election, if the Senate is of the same party as that president, which is why it's absolutely okay with.
Okay. But, my recollection, of course, was that the first justification was, well, this isn't me, this is the Biden rule. So what does the so-called Biden rule
justification.
say? Yeah, the Biden rule says just no confirmations in the last year, even though it wasn't a rule. It was just a thing that happened.
And it wasn't the last year, it was the
Yeah.
last fall.
Right. So in the election season, post conventions and all sorts, and, that was, I guess, somewhat more plausible. The idea that, well, the American people would like to have a say in this. And, in February of 2016, I think, the American people were still, worried about the early primaries. We weren't really focusing, well, should have been focusing on the Supreme Court, certainly, but the idea that, no, there's something wrong with the guy that we decided we want to make those decisions last time should make it. After all, that's the job we gave him.
And now, of course, we have, thank you, Susan Collins, to come full circle in my my hatosphere.
Sure.
Susan Collins helping get Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh onto the Supreme Court, where they decide things like, well, maybe fetal tissue does have personhood.
Sure. Why not?
Sure. That the decision yesterday from the Supreme Court. Yesterday? Monday?
Oh.
Yesterday, because
All right.
Memorial Day.
So they throw in a personhood for fetal tissue. They should put...
That was the Indiana abortion law, and there was a lot of focus on the fact that they said no, despite what Clarence Thomas says, this isn't eugenics. Actually, that's not what they said. They said they weren't ruling on the merits of the case. It was because there hadn't been two circuit decisions. There wasn't a circuit split. So they didn't see a reason not to uphold the previous circuit's decision, which was that you can't ban so-called discriminatory abortions.
Okay.
Based on, which don't happen, by the way,
Yeah.
except for the case of an extreme disability in the fetus, and sometimes not even an extreme disability, sometimes something like Down syndrome. But, yeah, maybe the parents should be able to make the decision whether they think they're going to be capable of raising a child with that kind of disability. So, anyway, these abortions really don't happen all that frequently anyway, but Indiana was going to ban them. The court said no. The circuit court, first court, appeals court, Supreme Court said, yeah, we're not going to overturn that decision. But on the other part of it, where the remains of the abortion, the medical waste from an abortion, has to either be cremated or buried as it were a lost child.
Can you nominate it to the Supreme Court? Is that something you can do? Because I think they even younger.
What's very frightening about that is it is one step closer to that saying a fertilized egg and the stuff that happens in the weeks following the fertilization of the egg actually count as a person.
Yeah. Well, we've been through the carrying that scenario to the logical extremes before, and all right. Well.
Maybe Mitch McConnell and Susan Collins will do one thing, and that is finally make people say, oh, hey, maybe I should be voting for president based on this Supreme Court thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well.
Maybe.
You would think that people would have gotten that message, and, people have kind of tried very hard to make people think that way for a long time, and I don't know. So far it hasn't worked, but maybe now, I don't know.
Maybe
something else has to happen.
Having Kavanaugh, having the whole process of the hearings, maybe it's people. I think that you grow up with this idea that the Supreme Court is supreme, that somehow through the process, people who get there are smart and are principled and know what they are doing, and they wouldn't be on the Supreme Court anyway if they weren't good people. So that institution is safe. We don't have to worry about it. It's going to be a fair arbiter of all of these issues.
It's possible that's as good an explanation as any, because I don't know. Yeah, I'm just really worried that this is another example of the failure, the constant failure of it'll get so bad there will be a revolution theory of politics. Well, I don't think
let's
so.
elect Trump because, that'll make it so awful that finally we'll win.
Yeah. Well, that pops up every now and again, and usually among a new generation of voters who has not seen it fail before, or I guess only very rarely do people come back and say, "It didn't work last time, but this time it's definitely going to work." But it does. It comes up from time to time, and in lots of contexts, and not just the presidential context. Like one of my old favorite stories of working on the Hill in '92. 93 and having people say, maybe we should lose, control of the House, and then people will see how bad it can get with Gingrich. All right. I mean, not all right. Don't.
Talk about slippery slopes.
Yep.
Look what's happened since then.
Yeah. So I've not seen any evidence that the revolution is imminent, ever. So people are pretty resilient in terms. What's funny is that they're resilient in terms of their suffering. Oh, we could take almost anything.
What they're going to be willing to put up with.
Yeah. Well, we got a lot of consumer goods to distract us in this country, and it's, I guess.
Well, a lot of them come from China. A lot of them are going to be a lot more expensive here in the coming months. So,
finally,
maybe that'll do it.
Tariff our way into the revolution. Why not? I guess anything could work. Yeah, although that was another of my favorite theories, was that this was the theory underlying the drive from the transition of communist China to new capitalist communist China. And what we'll do is we'll take on the evils of capitalism in order to pump out enough consumer goods to distract the Americans from the collapse of their own system and thereby win in the long term. But I don't think that works any better, by the way. No. I'll just inform the Chinese on that one. Oh, well. Yes. Well, McConnell would certainly be chief on your mind today, and I imagine there'll be the focus of a lot of discussion there.
Yes. Yes, he's always right up there at the top.
Yeah.
Of course, we've got Mueller coming up in 5 minutes.
Yes, right. He deliberately waited until after the show. I asked him to. Please don't interrupt. And he said, okay.
We have important things to get through.
Yes, that's right. I won't be able to finish these articles if you begin speaking. But apparently a short statement. I don't know. For some reason, people are trading in the idea that it will be an 8-minute statement. Is that, I don't know what that's supposed to mean.
I have seen no confirmation of why it would be an 8-minute statement. But
and what it possibly would mean, I don't know. But I got a short statement, and
people are talking about the fact that Barr is out of town. People are talking about, well, the Justice Department announced it. We don't know. We don't know until
I have no guess. But yeah, I was a little annoyed to find out earlier this morning that he was still reluctant to testify because he felt bad about it.
Well, and if he's willing to go out and make a statement on national TV, it's really hard to argue against the fact that, hey, it'd be fine for him to. I mean, he's making press statements.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
that's political in and of itself. So
right.
Yeah, go ahead and talk to Congress.
I guess so. I mean, certainly 8 minutes is certainly different from, 8 hours or whatever he'd have to do. And I guess he wouldn't find it terribly inconsistent to come out and say, this is my press statement saying I'm not making any more press statements.
This is my statement to the public saying I won't be making any public statements to Congress.
Yeah. I mean, that's not even the weirdest thing that could happen this morning, I'm sure.
Oh,
so
no. There's so many weird things.
We'll see. I guess tune in for that. We'll be discussing that tomorrow. I imagine that'll occupy a large part of your day as well.
Quite possibly.
Okay.
Mark Sumner's going to be maybe live. I don't know if there's going to be enough substance to live blog, but it'll be on the front page of Daily Kos.
Yes.
Right now. Live at the moment.
Might as well.
You want to go there and speculate.
I do. Let's go there next. And in the meantime, we'll make Justice Putnam take up the reins here. He's not going to be able to watch this thing live. We'll all have to text and tweet him what's happening so he can update us all. So I guess we'll have digested it by next week, and we'll see whether it's still top of mind And if it's an announcement that he's going to testify in some way, then I guess, yeah.
Well, and here's where I announce that I will be gone for the next 3 weeks.
You know what? Here's where I announce it. This is it.
I'm going to France.
Are you?
I'm not playing. I am not here next week or the 2 weeks after.
Well, excellent. Enjoy that. Jim, Trump's friend, doesn't go to France anymore, so it should be a great time. Well, enjoy that. And
I will.
Tell the French people that we've had enough of Marine Le Pen. Send her to Brussels and then be done with it, I guess.
Okay.
But enjoy the trip. And
PM in Britain.
Yeah. I'll try and keep the place open and running for you and still the United States of America. Hopefully they'll let you back in with your passport and all that stuff.
I appreciate that.
But if not, hang out in France for a little while. We'll come and visit. Thank you, Joan. Okay, au revoir. That's my only French for now. Thanks again for coming by. Enjoy your trip. We'll catch up with you when we see you next. Tweet us something in French.
All right.
Okay.
I'll do my best.
Take care, Joan. All right, up next, of course, Justice Putnam. And I'll tell you a little bit
From
what
Daily
he's got on
Kos
tap
Radio
after this.
On networksradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show.
With David Waldman.
Okay, this looks good. Trump's profanity-laden public tirades raises the question of hypocrisy facing Trump-supporting conservatives and religious leaders. I don't think that's going to work out as well as we thought. The West prepares for a brutal wildfire season. I guess that's coming up again. And now Trump takes aim at firefighting jobs with a huge federal cutback. Amazing.